Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining today's web conference, Phases and Types of African Swine Fever. Please note that all participant lines will be muted until the Q&A portion of the call. We will provide you instructions on how to ask a verbal question at that time. You are welcome to submit written questions during the presentation, and these will be addressed during Q&A. To submit a written question, use the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Choose all panelists from the Send To drop-down menu. If you require technical assistance, please send a note to the event producer. With that, I will turn the call over to Liz Fernandez. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Liz Fernandez with the Professional Development Services Branch, and I'd also like to welcome you to the webinar today. Our speaker today is Dr. Jim Roth. Dr. Roth is a distinguished professor in the Department of Veterinary Microbiology and Preventative Medicine at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Iowa State University and a member of the National Academy of Medicine. He received his DVM and PhD degrees from ISU and has been on faculty since 1977. He worked as a veterinarian in a mixed animal practice in Iowa from 1975 until 1977, and he's the director of the Center for Food Security and Public Health. Dr. Roth's primary area of research expertise is in immunity to infectious diseases of food-producing animals. He has testified before congressional committees on biosecurity preparedness, on efforts to address bioterrorism and agroterrorism, and on the need for vaccines for foreign animal diseases. Dr. Roth served on the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity from 2005 to 2014. And with that, I'm going to turn the webinar over to Dr. Roth.
All right, thank you, Liz. And thank you for the opportunity to give a presentation reviewing the phases and types of an ASF outbreak in the U.S. I'll provide background on the document and how it was developed, some background on African swine fever that's relevant to the response. Then I'll review some of the aspects in the document and some of the aspects of the Secure Pork Supply Plan that are also relevant to ASF. And this document was developed as part of the Secure Pork Supply Plan. Let's see. So the goal of this document is to develop guidelines to aid in rapid decision-making to facilitate response planning and development of business continuity plans in the event of an ASF outbreak in the U.S. And as with all of the documents in the Secure Pork Supply Plan, this is guidelines only. Responsible regulatory officials will make decisions based on outbreak-specific information. But it's helpful to have documents like this developed that have been discussed by regulatory officials, industry, and others, and thought about ahead of time and come to a consensus on how the response could go. But again, these are guidelines only. So this document, we began development of it in 2014 and finalized it in 2015 as part of the Secure Pork Supply Plan. And the work on the Secure Pork Supply Plan has been funded by APHIS Veterinary Services and by the National Pork Board. This document is patterned after the phases and types of an FMD outbreak document, which was the first document of this type we developed. This one is actually much simpler than the FMD document. It was reviewed and revised by the Secure Pork Supply Planning Committee, by APHIS VS, by state animal health officials, by members of industry and academia. It was posted on the Secure Pork Supply website in 2015, and then this past August, I updated it with information from the current OIE Terrestrial Animal Health Code. That code is updated every year. That was the only change I made, was to incorporate the new information from the most recent OIE Terrestrial Animal Health Code. In August, I sent it to APHIS VS personnel, to National Pork Board and American Association of Swine Veterinarians, again to be distributed in their organizations and reviewed. Didn't get any comments or suggestions for changes after that was sent out. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, there's an ASF exercise full-day exercise this Wednesday, it may be that recommendations will come out of there for changes to this document. It's available on the Secure Pork Supply Plan website. If you go to the regulatory officials drop-down, and then disease information, African swine fever, there's quite a bit of information on African swine fever, including the guidelines for classification of phases and types of an outbreak. Or you can use this web link at the bottom of the screen to go directly to this document. And this is the front page of the document dated August 16, 2018, with the newest OAE guidelines incorporated. So the goals for a response to an ASF outbreak are to prevent the disease spread and eliminate ASF virus from the U.S. as quickly as possible. And this will require a very aggressive stop movement, surveillance, tracing, and stamping out program, and potentially the need to eliminate feral swine in an area, if possible. Another goal is to prevent ASF from becoming established in feral swine. Once it's established in feral swine, it's very, very difficult to eliminate it. And to conduct surveillance, eventually, to rapidly reestablish the U.S. as free of African swine fever. Now some background on the disease and the virus. ASF only affects pigs and closely related species. Of course, it also affects feral swine and various species of wild pigs can be infected. Warthogs and bush pigs in Africa are the reservoir species for this virus in Africa and have been for many decades. And it's important to remember ASF is not a public health or food safety concern. It does not affect people. I apologize, everyone. I bumped the wrong button and got disconnected. We practiced a lot. We were all ready. We didn't anticipate me pushing the wrong button, so I apologize. And where I left off is that ASF is not a public health or food safety concern, and it's very important that we all have that message in mind if we do get an ASF outbreak here. So just quickly, some methods that it's transmitted. Direct contact with infected pigs, and it's usually oral nasal exposure as compared to aerosol or something else. The virus is shed in all of the secretions and excretions, high concentrations in blood and tissues. And environmental contamination is a concern. So ingestion of contaminated pork products, if they're imported from another country, fed to pigs. Of course, uncooked swill and waste is not supposed to be fed to pigs in the U.S., but it could happen. And carcasses. And recently there's been concern about ingestion of contaminated feed, which may come in from ASF-positive countries.
Okay. It's an extra.
So we're getting, I don't know if that's you, Liz, but I'm hearing a little discussion in the background.
Yeah, that's not me. I'm not sure if it's Noreen, but I heard that also.
Okay. So it can be transmitted by fomites, clothing, vehicles, equipment, and again, the environmental contamination with blood, diarrhea, feces. It can be, and in Africa, it's maintained in a soft tick vector. The ticks are infected for life, and they're in the burrows of the warthogs or bush pigs, and the ticks transmit the virus to newborn animals while they're in the burrow and maintain this virus in Africa in the tick-to-pig transmission cycle. There is concern that other insects, biting insects, may be able to transmit the virus either mechanically or through transmission of blood also. That can't be ruled out. So the virus is found in all tissues and body fluids. Very high levels are found in the blood, so you can get massive environmental contamination from necropsying, or if the pig has bloody diarrhea. And this virus is highly resistant to environmental conditions. It can survive for extended periods depending on where it's at and the temperature. up to 1.5 years in blood stored at 4 degrees, 11 days in feces at room temperature, a month in contaminated pig pens, 50 days in bone meat stored at 4 degrees, 140 days in salted dried hams, and several months to years in frozen meat. And of course, these are just examples where it's been proven to last that long. Another important consideration is ASF isolates vary in virulence from highly pathogenic strains that cause near 100% mortality to low virulence isolates that can be difficult to diagnose and look like a number of other diseases. The high virulence ones, of course, are more likely to be found quickly than the low virulence strains of the virus. And survivors can become lifelong virus carriers, so it's important to identify survivors and eliminate them from the herd. There's no vaccine or treatment for ASF, and that really is a driving factor for how we would need to respond to become ASF-free. With foot and mouth disease and classical swine fever, if we have an extremely large outbreak, there's the potential to vaccinate, suppress the level of virus infection, and then move to eradication. For ASF, there is no potential for vaccination, so there's a need to aggressively work to stamp it out as soon as it gets here. And ASF-free trade status cannot be recovered after an outbreak until surveillance proves that the virus is not present in any pigs, including both domestic and feral pigs in the country or zone. That's to have OIE recognition as ASF-free. There are some ways to do trade with live animals and fresh meat according to OIE guidelines if we still are not ASF-free. So the World Organization for Animal Health, as I'm sure you all know, produces a terrestrial animal health code, and this contains the internationally accepted standards for trade in animals and animal products and for regaining ASF-free status. And this is found in Chapter 15.1. And this is the current version of the Terrestrial Animal Health Code with Chapter 15.1. This sets the international standards for trade in animals and animal products with related to ASF. So Article 15.1.8 provides recommendations for importation from countries or zones not free from ASF for live, domestic, and captive wild pigs. So in order to trade if a country is positive, the veterinary authorities of the importing country should require the presence of an international veterinary certificate attesting that the animals showed no clinical signs of ASF on the day of shipment and either were kept since birth or for the past 3 months in a compartment free from ASF, or were kept in a quarantine station, isolated for 30 days prior to shipment, and were subjected to a virological test and a serological test performed at least 21 days after entry into the quarantine station with negative results. So it is possible to export live animals from an ASF-positive country by meeting these requirements. And of course, the importing country has to accept the information. Article 15.1.14 provides recommendations for importation from countries or zones not free from ASF for fresh meat of domestic and captive wild pigs. So the veterinary authorities of the importing country should require the presentation of an international veterinary certificate attesting that, 1, the entire consignment of fresh meat comes from animals which originated from herds in which surveillance, in accordance with the code, demonstrates that no case of ASF has occurred in the past 3 years. This period can be reduced to 12 months when the surveillance demonstrates that there is no evidence of tick involvement in the epidemiology of the infection. In addition, samples from a statistically representative number of animals were tested for ASF with negative results. And number two, the entire consignment of fresh meat comes from animals which have been slaughtered in an approved slaughterhouse and have been subjected to favorable results to ante and post-mortem inspections in accordance with the code. And necessary precautions have been taken after slaughter to avoid contact with the fresh meat with any source of ASF virus. So again, it is possible to export from an ASF positive country by meeting these requirements. And the introduction of ASF into previously negative countries has happened a number of times in the past, typically due to uncooked or undercooked pork products fed to pigs, and the products were imported illegally, and that happened in a number of cases, or raw pork waste and garbage at airport or shipping ports that ended up being fed to pigs. And the virus is also in infected wild boars is moving across country boundaries, and we're seeing that in Russia initially and into Eastern and now Western Europe, the movement of wild boars. So this shows the brief history of movement of ASF. For many decades, it was only found in Africa, and then it moved out of Africa into Georgia, and then into Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe. And now we see, and this is from the week of November 8th through the 14th, the red and blue circles in the west, or the east of Western Europe, those are all wild boar, infected wild boars during that week, and one in Belgium, or cases in Belgium also. But you'll note there are no cases of virus in domestic pigs in these countries during that week. There are cases in other countries, but it's moving across country boundaries in wild boar, and they've been fairly successful in keeping it out of commercial swine from exposure to wild boars. And this is a recent situation in China. And of course, it's a situation in Europe and China that is causing great concern for the U.S. China does not seem to be able to get it stopped. It's now in most of the dense swine-producing regions of China. The darker the color on this map, the more dense the swine production, number of swine per square kilometer. Most recently, the Sichuan province, which is one of the largest pork-producing areas of China, has been found to be positive. And this shows for the week of November 8th through 14th, the confirmed cases, and the ASF is in domestic swine in Romania and Ukraine, had outbreaks, and these are all wild boar confirmed positives without also having confirmed positives in commercial swine in these countries. So the USDA-APHIS prepared the disease response strategy for African swine fever in 2013 and published it. This is on the USDA FAD Prep website, and it emphasizes the importance of the stamping out approach with depopulation, surveillance and investigation, quarantine and movement control, and wildlife management and control. And this document is available, as I said, on FAD Prep site or directly by clicking on this link. So I mentioned that the phases and type for ASF is patterned after the phases and types of FMD responses. This was developed and finalized in 2013 as part of the Secure Food Supply Plans involving foot and mouth disease. And this approach provides for strategies for the response to and management of an FMD outbreak, and that the response will change as the outbreak progresses and will depend on the magnitude and location and other characteristics of the outbreak. And this is relatively complicated for foot and mouth disease. If it's a small focal outbreak, all of the emphasis would be on stamping out. Moderate regional outbreak would be stamping out plus aided by vaccination to slow the spread. Large regional outbreak, we would be depending a lot on vaccine to help control the spread. Widespread national outbreak probably would stop stamping out in most cases and depend on vaccination. Type 5 catastrophic U.S. outbreak, the outbreak is out of control, likely won't come under control at least for a year or more, and we would be counting on massive vaccination to control the outbreak without stamping out. Catastrophic North American is, it's not just the U.S., but Canada and or Mexico would be involved also. So for FMD, it's a rather complicated set of types of outbreaks. And we then, as part of Secure Pork, we developed phases and types of CSF and ASF responses with a lot of input from regulatory officials in the industry. These are available on the Secure Pork Supply website. For all three diseases, the same 5 phases are used for the outbreak. And the phase is the temporal situation where we're in the outbreak. And I'll go through those in a little bit. The types are the magnitude of the outbreak and how the response might change. For FMD, I just showed you quickly the 6 types. Classical swine fever, there are 4 types. And African swine fever, only 2 types of outbreaks in this document. So why the differences? ASF and CSF infect swine only, whereas FMD infects all cloven-hoofed animals. This would allow more of the resources to be focused only on swine and fewer susceptible animals that could be involved and need to be dealt with. Lack of ASF vaccine increases the importance of rapid detection and aggressive measures to stamp out infected herds. Virulence of the strains and ability to detect them. Both classical swine fever and African swine fever have highly virulent strains and also low virulent strains that can be confused with other diseases. So there's concern with those 2 viruses, especially that the low virulent strains could become established before we are aware of it and might become relatively widespread. And these types also consider the OIE rules for regaining disease freedom, especially with the use of vaccine for FMD and classical swine fever. So the different types, with African swine fever, there's only 2 types in this document. An outbreak of high virulence ASF virus or a focal or moderate regional outbreak with low virulence virus. And type 2 would be a large regional or widespread national outbreak with low virulence ASF virus. Now the virus that is spreading in Asia and Europe and including China is high virulence. So that's the one that it seems would be most likely that may spread to the U.S. because that's the strains in those parts of the world are high virulent strains. The low virulent strains, we can't discount those, and that they may come in, for example, if they were to come in through a garbage feeding operation that has outdoor housed animals in an area with a lot of feral swine. The virus could be introduced and get into feral swine and become widespread before we know that we've got it. And that would then be a type 2 outbreak. So the different phases for the ASF outbreak, heightened alert phase is where ASF is discovered in Canada, Mexico, or the Caribbean, but not the U.S. So we are on heightened alert that the virus is nearby. The recommendations are to implement an enhanced national ASF surveillance plan, including feral swine, slaughter plants, and ports of entry. Conduct tracing and surveillance of swine imported from the ASF-affected country within the last 2 incubation periods. And an incubation period defined by OIE is 15 days, and that's the maximum incubation period. Typical incubation period is shorter than that, so they go for 2 incubation periods, which is 30 days, prior to the date of first infection of the index case. And then initiate stop movement, quarantine, and perhaps stamping out of herds in the U.S. with epidemiologic evidence of direct or indirect contact with infected herds. Steps to take upon the first case of ASF in the U.S. and throughout the outbreak. Advise all swine operations, including markets, fairs, exhibitions, etc., in the U.S. to implement ASF-specific biosecurity plans and continue until freedom from ASF is reestablished. Emphasize and enhance enforcement of requirements for garbage feeding of swine in the U.S., and probably a recommendation that garbage feeding be discontinued, although in some states it's illegal to feed garbage. Other states it's legal if the garbage is adequately cooked. And my understanding is that's under a state law, not federal law, unless there's a declaration of an emergency. Allow movement of non-susceptible animals and their products, including eggs and milk, from the control area, from premises with no swine on the premises, into commerce with enhanced truck and driver biosecurity for the duration of the outbreak, to allow those just-in-time products to continue to move. So phase 1 of the outbreak is a period of time from the confirmation of the first ASF case in the U.S. until there is reasonable evidence to estimate the extent of the outbreak. The transition to phase 2 should be accomplished as soon as possible with a goal of less than 4 days. The first steps would be to establish control areas around the infected premises and contact premises, and the responsible regulatory officials will decide how large those control areas are. And this is not in the phases and types document, but a nationwide 72-hour standstill of swine may be recommended by APHIS. And that is something that was recommended in the RMAR exercise for FMD and is apparently going to be recommended for the exercise on Wednesday. And that leaves us with the problem of what to do with the swine that are in transit. And that's estimated to be about 1 million pigs per day on weekdays. Those pigs that are in transit when the first case is discovered need to be landed somewhere. They should, the recommendation is they should continue to the destination, especially if it's to a harvest facility. Return to the premises of origin, and I put a question mark there because that's in the Secure Pork Supply Plan and the Phases and Types document, but the document on initial movement guidance for Wednesday's exercise indicates that swine should not be returned to the premises of origin for reasons that they'll get into, or euthanize them if they're from a control area or epidemiologically linked to an infected premises if they're in transit. Also in phase 1, initiate rapid quarantine and stamping out, preferably within 24 hours, of the infected and contact herds. Implement a validated enhanced national ASF surveillance plan. Enforce biosecurity protocols within the control areas and recommend that all other premises also have enhanced biosecurity. Work with USDA, APHIS, Wildlife Services, and other appropriate federal, state, and tribal authorities to initiate the containment, testing, and then eradication of feral swine in the control area if possible. Phase 2 is the period of time shortly after phase 1, within a few days. Surveillance and epidemiology provides timely evidence of the extent of the outbreak and the virulence of the ASF virus strain to support planning and decision-making by the Unified Incident Command, including area commands. The response strategy may depend on whether the strain is of high virulence or low virulence and the extent of a low virulence outbreak. So in phase 2, a type 1 outbreak is any outbreak of high virulence ASF virus or a focal or moderate regional outbreak with low virulence ASF virus. Implement aggressive stop movement and stamping out of infected and contact herds rapidly. Stamping out of feral swine populations in the control area if possible. And continue this aggressive stop movement and stamping out until ASF-free status is obtained. An outbreak of low virulence strain of ASF virus may be widespread before it's detected and may be difficult to trace based on clinical signs alone. An outbreak of low virulence ASF virus with one or a few focal areas of infection limited to a region with low to moderate swine numbers on a small to medium-sized premises would still be considered a type 1 outbreak and should be aggressively stamped out. An extensive outbreak with low virulence ASF would be considered a type 2 ASF outbreak. Again, during a type 1 outbreak, rapid depopulation within 24 hours of infected and contact premises, including trace back and trace forward from all infected premises, implementation of biosecurity, cleaning and disinfection and virus elimination, and biosecure carcass disposal. Only allow movement of pigs from the control area after an epidemiologic evaluation indicates no evidence of direct or indirect contact with infected swine. Audited biosecurity, according to the SPS plan, must be in place on a premises. Pigs may be required to test negative for ASF virus and/or ASF antibody before movement from the control area. And then survey infected premises for presence of ASF virus soft tick vectors or their life cycle stages and eliminate those vectors. Also during a type 1 outbreak, conduct intensive surveillance in the control area and surveillance zones and dangerous contact premises, including feral swine. Work with wildlife services and appropriate federal, state, and tribal authorities to contain, test, and then eradicate, if possible, feral swine in the control area. If feral swine are involved, institute tick control programs in the control areas. And if there is evidence of infected feral swine, depopulate all swine premises in the control area that do not have sufficient biosecurity to ensure that feral swine do not infect domestic swine. So for a type 2 outbreak, which would be a large regional or widespread national outbreak with low virulence ASF, and again, this is probably unlikely that the virus that's circulating and spreading in Asia, Europe, and China is high virulence, but it is possible that a low virulence isolate could get in and could be spread in feral swine and then to domestic swine before we realize it. So in that case, multiple areas of infection with low virulence ASF are detected in a region where the type, number, and or size of infected and contact herds are too great to consider only a stamping out strategy. It may be desirable to depopulate some premises by movement of healthy animals to slaughter. And in a type 2 outbreak, we would want to implement all of the recommendations under a type 1 outbreak, with the exception that a modified stamping out policy may be used. Some infected and contact premises may be depopulated by movement of healthy animals to slaughter. All infected premises should be depopulated by either stamping out or slaughter or a combination, cleaned and virus eliminated. Some swine production systems, if they become infected with ASF virus, should develop a plan for controlled depopulation and repopulation of the premises within their system. And that would have to be approved by the responsible regulatory officials. Healthy animals from an ASF virus infected herd should be slaughtered with implementation of biosecurity during transportation and at the processing facility to avoid transmission of virus to negative herds. So that's the phase 2 while we're working to get the outbreak under control. Phase 3 is when surveillance and epidemiologic evidence indicates that the outbreak is under control and a plan is implemented to regain ASF-free status according to the OIE Terrestrial Animal Health Code. Phase 4, the United States is declared free of, what happened there? Is declared free of ASF virus. The USDA continues to work to convince trading partners to accept U.S. exports of swine and pork products. So after the OIE declares the U.S. to be free, the individual trading partners need to be convinced to accept our exports. A couple of recommendations that are part of secure pork supply, not in the phases and types document, related to the 72-hour standstill, new recommendations that are being made. And again, there's approximately 1 billion pigs in transit each day. And the state animal health officials will need to decide how the animals in transit at the beginning of an outbreak will be landed, will be sent somewhere. The SPS plan recommends the following options should be considered for pigs in transit originating from within a control area. And this is for FMDs, CSF, or ASF. For swine in transit to a packing plant, the swine should proceed to the packing plant and be processed on schedule with the agreement of the packing plant. The packing plant has to agree to accept the animals. For swine moving between premises for different stages of production, one of the following options may be used. Return the animals to the most recent premises of origin, if possible, with the agreement of the owner of the premises of origin. And again, the exercise on Wednesday, the recommendation is in the document sent out previously is that they should not go back to the premises of origin. Allow the animals to proceed to their intended destination with the agreement of the owner of the premises of the destination. So the state animal health officials have to agree, and the owners of the premises or packing plant have to agree to these dispositions. If the first two options are not possible, then humanely euthanize and safely dispose of the animals while in transit. Another aspect of the Secure Pork Supply Plan is a document related to controlled swine movement to and through a packing facility. And this applies to all three swine viruses, and none of those viruses are a public health or food safety concern. So animals that pass ante-mortem and post-mortem inspection by FSIS are safe for human consumption, even if they may be in the preclinical stage or recovery phase of infection with one of those viruses. And products should be able to enter normal commerce, and even realizing they may have low levels of those virus. And it's also important to remember that product from infected premises may already have entered commerce. So if we don't allow those products to enter commerce and then decide it's necessary to recall products from commerce, where do you stop recalling products? So if they pass FSIS inspection, they're safe and wholesome for human consumption. And then emphasize and enhance enforcement of requirements for garbage feeding of swine in the U.S., and preferably recommend that garbage feeding not be allowed. So that's the end of the presentation. This is the Secure Food Supply, or Center for Food Security and Public Health team that works with me on these and many other projects. And now I think we have time for questions.
We do have time for questions, and I have quite a few written questions for you, Dr. Roth.
Okay.
The first question is, does the United States have any ticks that are known or suspected to be able to transmit African swine fever virus?
Yes, I've read that there are some species of soft ticks in the U.S. that could potentially harbor the virus similar to the soft ticks in Africa. I don't know that that's been, I'm pretty sure it's probably not been documented to occur, but there is that potential.
Okay. The next written question is, what are the anticipated implications for the Chinese population? And do we expect a famine to follow such a widespread ASF outbreak?
Could you say that again? Do we expect?
What are the anticipated implications for the Chinese population? And do we expect a famine to follow such a widespread ASF outbreak?
Oh, a famine. Well, this is, beyond my area of expertise, but it's becoming obvious they're having a great deal of difficulty controlling it. China produces about half the pigs in the world, and it's a very, very important source of protein in the Chinese diet. I've heard that they're increasing consumption of poultry and decreasing consumption of pork because of movement restrictions. And I don't know, of course, but I don't know that famine would ensue, but there could be a lot of unhappy people in China if they aren't able to get their normal amount of pork that they've had in their diet recently.
The next written question is, what is the recommended or SOP for disposal of carcasses and disinfection of premises with ASF?
Lori Miller gave a webinar on that topic in the last week or two and went through the various options. And so I won't get into that. That's not my area of expertise, but there was a very good webinar on carcass disposal and disinfection for ASF. And I assume
I can send that out. I think it was recorded, and I will try and make sure I get that out to everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Another question is, what is the virulence of ASF in feral swine? So, and is there the potential of developing a reservoir as with wart or bush hogs in Africa?
Again, I'm not certain of that, but many of our feral swine are wild domestic swine that escaped or some crossbreeding. We know it would be highly virulent in the feral swine that are escaped domestic swine. And I should invite others on the call, experts from Plum Island or APHIS Veterinary Services that can comment on some of these questions, because many of them will probably be outside of my area of expertise.
Okay, so we do have another question. What are recommendations for hog farm workers who travel to China or Eastern Europe on vacation, for example?
Okay. So the general recommendations are they should, of course, not bring back any pork products and to not bring back any contaminated clothing, shoes, or anything like that. Shower thoroughly and have several days downtime before going on to the site. Those would be the general recommendations. To be very careful not to bring back anything that could be carrying the virus. And not just China, but that includes Russia, Eastern Europe, parts of Western Europe, most of Africa.
Okay, we do have a couple more questions. Do the types of ASF change virulence readily? Can they switch from low virulence to high virulence, similar to low path mutating into high path AI?
My understanding is that it isn't nearly as frequent as low path AI going to high path, or as quick. And I don't know that it would mutate that fast. I think this is a more stable virus. But perhaps, again, some of the virologists who work with this may want to comment on that.
Okay. The other question is, would you recommend both serology and PCR for surveillance for ASF?
It depends on the situation. PCR is very good early in an outbreak in a herd when there's a lot of virus around. In low virulence, the infection may have gone on for a while. It may be difficult to detect the virus by PCR, and serology would be needed to find those herds that have been infected for a period of time. And in the OIE code, they recommend for exporting live animals after they've been in quarantine for 30 days is do both PCR and serology, so you can detect virus or antibody.
Okay. Another question is, given the U.S. experience with PED spreading from contaminated slaughter plants, is there a plan to minimize transmission of ASF from potentially contaminated slaughter plants?
The Secure Pork Supply Plan does have a lot of biosecurity recommendations, including at slaughter plants. And that would be very important with ASF because it is a fairly hardy virus. So there would need to be truck and driver biosecurity when leaving the slaughter plant before going to premises that has pigs. And then premises that have pigs also have biosecurity as part of the secure pork supply plan for hopefully preventing virus from being transmitted from the truck to the pig. So there are plans in place and recommendations for biosecurity as part of the secure pork supply plan.
Okay, and that was another question that was linked to that one. It says, does that change the recommendation in the initial stages of an outbreak?
The initial stages, those would hopefully already be in place. Of course, in the initial stages, when the first case is discovered, it's going to take time to get the control areas established, to do tracebacks and trace forwards, to get stop movement established, and to implement the level of biosecurity needed if it's not already in place. So there will be some days at the beginning where all of those things need to get up and implemented as quickly as possible. And that would be a good reason for the stop movement, is for those things to get in place, that biosecurity can be in place before additional movements occur.
Okay, so we do have another written question, and it says, if tick vector transmission of ASF is associated with burrowing, do we know to what degree feral swine in the USA burrow? EU experts state that tick transmission of ASF is not involved in the EU in large part due to wild boar lack of burrowing. So do we know, do our feral swine burrow?
I don't know. I know they did a lot. And it may not just be the burrows, but wherever they nest. If the ticks get established wherever they nest, whether it's in a burrow or not, then the ticks are infected for life. The wild swine can be infected for life. So it may not depend on burrowing per se.
Okay. Do we have any verbal questions?
Or comments from ASF experts who want to
yes, if you
correct
want
or elucidate whatever I say.
Yeah, if somebody wants to make a comment, you can push #2 on your phone and we can unmute you.
Ladies and gentlemen, as we move to Q&A, please press #2 on your telephone keypad. You will hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please then state your name and question.
I do have 2 more written questions that just came in. Are javelinas susceptible to the virus?
I think I've read they're less susceptible, but I'm not certain about that. I think we would have to assume they are until proven otherwise.
Right. And then the other question is, what controls are there on international waste coming from flights?
Again, this is probably better answered by someone else, but international waste is not to be fed to pigs, is my understanding, from flights or ships. So that doesn't qualify for cooking, is my understanding.
Correct. And do we have something identifying types of surveillance needed during each phase?
No, as far as I know, the specific protocols for surveillance, I'm not aware of those. And our non-labs would need to be ready for surge capacity. We would need to have validated PCR and serology tests. And accredited veterinarians or state and federal veterinarians who are trained and ready to collect the appropriate samples on large numbers of animals and herds quite quickly.
And I did get a comment. Plum Island has documented that javelina are not susceptible to ASF.
Okay.
There you go. Yeah. Do we have any additional questions, comments?
Once again, pressing pound 2 will indicate you wish to ask a question or give a feedback.
We do have another written question. What serological and PCR tests are validated for ASF at this time?
And I don't want to speak to that because I know the NOM labs are working on that, and I'm not exactly sure where they're at in validated tests.
Okay. And we are getting questions like crazy here. Let's go back to again. What precautions should be taken with products already imported from affected countries?
Well, meat products should not be fed to swine. As always, pork products should be cooked thoroughly and should never be fed to swine uncooked, but that's always the case. And there are import controls in place to avoid bringing in any products that might be infected with ASF. And that's according to the OIE guidelines. So once it's here, we should assume that once the product is here, we should assume that it came in under, unless it was illegally imported. If it came in legally, it was, through the appropriate channels and meeting all the appropriate guidelines. But still don't feed it to pigs uncooked.
So we do have another question. What is the proposed protocol for feral swine elimination in a large geographic area?
And I don't know that. And I haven't seen a protocol, and that's a very difficult thing to accomplish. So that would be a question for perhaps Wildlife Services.
Well, the good thing is that I will get all these questions, and I will go ahead and highlight them and maybe send them to different people and try and get back to everyone with answers.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So the one question I also had, which I don't know if there's anybody on from Plum Island, but we're wondering who documented that javelinas are not susceptible to ASF, and I will have to look that up also.
But it was at Plum Island that was documented.
That's what they were saying. So we will look that up and figure that out. Okay, real-time PCR is validated for the NOM labs. So is that, I guess I'm assuming that's for ASF, right? Real-time PCR is validated for the NOM labs? Yes, okay. Okay, well, we're coming up to the top of the hour. I have to let you know, Dr. Roth, I have never done a webinar with this many people before. We actually maxed out the number of lines, so this is my one webinar that I'll keep in the record books. And I think that I want to thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule.
It's probably the only webinar also where the speaker hung up in the middle of it while trying to adjust his volume.
Well, I have to be honest with you. I have a little bit of a heart attack here, but that's okay.
Yeah, me too.
I'm glad it was you. So, and just for everyone that's still on the line, this webinar it was recorded, and it will be posted, and I will be sending out a link, where all of our webinars for the TEP are posted. So I will get that out as soon as it's ready to go. And we did hear that somebody said the javelina paper was from the 60s, and hopefully Dr. Gautier will let me know and send me a copy. So thanks again for everyone for joining us. It's been a great webinar. We do have another webinar coming up on December 18th with Dr. Pam Zabel, who will be discussing biosecurity for African swine fever and the secure pork supply. So hope you can all join us. We'll be sending out that information shortly. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you for joining today's conference. The session has now concluded and you may disconnect.